This is Stephen Sloan. The date is May 17th, 2011. I'm with Dr. Robert Anderson in his home, 4020 16th Street in Lubbock, Texas. I'm here with Robert DeBoard. We're doing this interview with the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission's Texas Liberators project. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for sitting down with me today. Well, let's begin. Let's go back to Chicago. Let's start in Chicago and tell me a little bit about your family and some of those early memories in Chicago.
Well, let's see, the best I can say is that both of us have come from Swedish families. And I lived in my early life, I was very closely associated with a Swedish church. The denomination is the Covenant, Evangelical Covenant. And at that time it was Swedish. So my early years were centered on Sweden, really. I mean, you know, all my grandparents came from Sweden, and my parents spoke Swedish and so on, but unfortunately they didn't speak Swedish to us. So, and I lived in the south side of Chicago and went to elementary school and high school, Calumet High School in Chicago. And when I was about 11, my father passed away, and then later my mother passed away, and I lived with my sister. I do want to say that Iris and I met when we were about 15 or 16 at a church Bible camp, because she also comes from Chicago in a ethnic community, very much more so than myself, actually, at North Park University. And I'd always wanted to go to school, and since in the late early 40s and so on, there wasn't much money. When I graduated from high school, I started at Illinois Institute of Technology, which is the old armor engineering school. And I started in a co-op program. In other words, we went to school one semester and then worked a semester and so on. And I was in that program, and I started in 42. At the time I was, I think, 18 and a half or something like that. And while there, of course, the war was going on, and many of us enlisted in the Army or Air Force or all four services at that time, so I wasn't drafted. And we anticipated going to school, at least I was in the Air Corps, and anticipated going to school for a degree. But in March 1943, they called us all up. And that was it, after about a year of school.
I want to go back and ask you, I forgot to mention that Iris Anderson is with us. She is watching. You can't see her on the camera, but she is watching. And she's here. I want to ask you a couple of questions about some things you've already mentioned. In particular, kind of the Swedish upbringing. You talked about that being very much a part of your early life.
Right.
What did that look like? I know you said language that didn't necessarily pass down, but what did that look like as far as, I guess, holidays and food and all those sorts of things?
Well, the food was very Swedish, although we did find in our numerous trips to Sweden later on that the folks that I lived with, all the Swedish folks, they cooked as of 1900. It wasn't contemporary Swedish cooking. And we always had the Swedish holidays. And at church, I think this is the correct, we went to Julete, which is the service at Christmas Eve. And my father was an organist in the church, and I didn't know anybody else but Swedes. Although I lived in I hesitate to say it this way, but another broader ethnic community that was Roman Catholic. And so I was actually a minority. Whereas Irish lived in a Swedish community in Chicago. And I suppose this might be of some interest, we had Irish mafia bootleggers in our neighborhood, very close to us. And I always like to tell the story that I remember as a kid when I was very young, Al Capone coming down the alley with his machine gun shooting up our neighbors. And so I never went out with my daddy and shot rabbits. We had the Chicago Mafia trying to knock off some neighbors, which they were succeeding in doing to a certain extent. And
I can imagine that would be a memory that would stay with you.
Well, it's a memory.
Yeah.
The leader of the family that were involved was Spike O'Donnell, and you can find him on the internet, on the web. There's interesting histories about him. So that was my early time, and.
But I guess in that neighborhood, the Swedes were more kind of caught in the middle. They weren't necessarily involved.
No.
In South Chicago.
No, they were not involved at all.
Now, what did your father do as an occupation?
My father was very fortunate. He was a salesman, and he was not tremendously affected by the Depression, although all our friends were. Mm-hmm. And he traveled quite a bit in Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, but he died in 1936. So from then on, things changed quite a bit.
Yeah, but the family weathered the early part of the Depression fairly well.
Yeah, and my older brother, passed away about 3 months before my father. So.
What a tough period.
Let's go on.
I understand. Was your sister older that you went and lived with your sister?
Yes, my sister was, let's see, she was born in 1913, so she was 9 years older than me. Mm. And she had been married, but subsequently divorced. And but I was very close to her. Mm. Well, in other words, until I went to the Army, she basically took care of me.
Yeah. Well, what were you studying, or I know later where you ended up as far as your intellectual pursuits, but what were you interested in as a kid, the sorts of things that...
Well, I went into IIT, and generally it was business. So my first positions as a co-op student was in accounting, but I was not a great accountant. And it was during that first year and a half at IIT that I had my introduction to psychology.
I see.
And then after the war, I decided to go that route.
Mm-hmm. Which, what was your exposure to psychology during that early period?
Well, I took a course.
Okay.
And a very dramatic old professor, and who I subsequently went back to after the war. But it had quite an impact on me. It was something I did well in,
Do you remember what it was about at that age, about psychology, that stimulated kind of your interest?
No, it was more just a general course, you know, the basic course.
I see.
And my mother had been very, very ill. And I was associated or had a lot of experience in hospitals and so on.
Yeah. Well, let's go forward a bit. You talked about the decision to enlist. You didn't have to enlist, so can you tell me a little bit about what you remember, the reasons behind deciding to enlist?
Well, the recruiters came to the university and they encouraged us to enlist, and everybody did. I mean, you know, if you weren't being drafted, I was 18, and if you weren't drafted, why, you weren't so good. So we had a choice of, you know, Coast Guard or Marines or Navy or Air Force or Army. You could enlist, and we did that, as I said, with the idea in mind that you would complete your education. People in the Navy programs, they generally completed their programs, but the people in the Army and the Air Force were pulled out and sent to various camps. So it was March 1943, and I went through the normal routine, you know, and wound up in St. Petersburg, Florida, for basic training in the Air Force. And we had a real rough time. I lived in a hotel that they had taken over as a barracks, but went through all the preliminaries, you know, the marching and all that stuff. And then following that, I was assigned to training as a radar operator. And I spent time doing some instructing and so on in radar, which was new at the time, and had quite a bit of experience around Bradenton, Sarasota, Florida, in that area, which was very primitive then. And then this business about the ASTP came up. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
The Army Specialized Training Program.
Yes.
And so I applied for that, and I was accepted. And my induction of that was at DeLand College, and I can't remember. It was near Sanford, Florida, near Orlando, that area. And from there, I was sent up to the University of Georgia in Athens, and this was in engineering. And the idea was that we were to go on and finish our degree programs. But as you probably know, and there's a lot of information about the ASTP, there were some 250,000 young men who were in the ASTP programs all over the nation. I don't know if Baylor had one. I know the University of Texas, El Paso, Texas Tech. I don't think Texas Tech did have a program at that time, but we were spread out all over. My neighbor, I think, was at the University of Washington or Washington State. And then, let's see, I went in ASTP around February, started the University of Georgia at Athens. In March of 1944, General Marshall decided, have you heard this story before?
No, please. We need to have it recorded here.
Oh, in March of 1944, they decided that the ASTP program was expendable and they needed troops to fill out the divisions that were going to Europe for the big invasion.
Yes.
And so they canceled the programs all over the nation. And all of us were put into various divisions. The only ones who were not put into the, taken out of the program were the people in the medical schools. So you'll find a few physicians around, and we have one of them living here, who went through medical school in the ASTP program. And of course they weren't through till after the war.
So do you remember the moment you heard the program was canceled and you were being...
Oh boy, we didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, they put us on a bus, and we went down to the 10th Armored Division, and 800 of us went into the 10th Armored as privates. And of course, the 10th Armored was an established division. It was formed in 1942. So it was, I mean, they had the officers and the enlisted people, the non-commissioned officers and so on. And we just filled in. And I was fortunate, since I had been in radar, I was put into the signal company, the 150th Signal Company. But many of my friends either went to be tankers or infantry and so on. Mm-hmm. And probably wouldn't be here if it had been that way. And so we went into March of 44, and by September, the division was sent overseas.
Yeah, well, by that point, you knew what you were training for. You knew what was next. I mean, you knew you were probably going to Europe.
We just knew we were going to Camp Shanks in New York. We didn't know where we were going.
You didn't know where you were going.
But we assumed as an armored division we were probably going to Europe.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask, as you were talking about it earlier, what did you think of Army life?
But I think I'm not a soldier. I adapted. I did what I had to do, but it wasn't my thing. And you just did what you had to do.
Yeah.
And there was no real love for it and so on, although a great deal of loyalty developed. As you can see here from that I've told you about my activities with the Veterans Association.
Mm-hmm.
So we went to Europe, and I want to mention one more thing about ASTP. A number of us who were in ASTP, at least from the 10th Armored, and I'm sure Dr. Hartman will tell you from the 11th Armored, after the war we were involved in the Veterans Association, and as the years have gone on, the leaders of those groups, like the Western Association, became the leaders of the Vets Association. So I have been the president of the 10th Armored Association. But we've all come up to leadership positions because we were all very well educated. Mm-hmm. Most of us continued on with our education in various forms, mm-hmm. either completing a bachelor's degree or going on for doctorates and various levels like that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Well, it is, because here I was a buck private, at the bottom of the hierarchy, and now I have become a leader in the group. And I think it's very interesting.
Had you traveled much in your younger years? I know later on in life you traveled quite a bit, yeah. But had you traveled much in your younger years?
Prior to the Army?
Yeah.
No, we spent a lot of time in Michigan, but no.
Well, this is all a lot to take in. Not only Army life, but going overseas and, well, going to the South, first of all, I probably had to have a little bit of culture shock.
Well, I'll tell you, if you're from Mississippi or had lived there, an experience when I was at the University of Georgia in Athens. I had a girlfriend, and her father was a professor at the University of Georgia. And they invited me over for Sunday dinner, and which, you know, you don't turn that down. So I went there, and it was a very formal Southern family. And at the Sunday dinner, they served some stuff, white stuff in a bowl. And they passed it to me, and I looked at it, and I couldn't figure out what the heck it was. It was hominy. And I didn't know how to eat it. And it just was, you know, it was a shock. And that was, but instead of the potatoes, it was a hominy.
Yeah.
That was my first experience, really, of the Southern culture.
Yes. And if they had doubts about you before, they probably had more doubts.
Pardon?
If the family had doubts about you before, they probably had more doubts after your dinner. Well, let's go up to shipping out from New York. Can you talk about that process? Just
we went to Camp Shanks. That was in New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Yeah. And we were put on ships. I was put on one of the old Liberty ships. These were the old 7-knot freighters, and another part of the division was put on a passenger ship, which promptly run aground as we headed out. And so we joined a convoy going across to Europe. I think it took 14 days. They could only go as fast as the slowest ship. We were on the slowest ship. I don't know how many of us were on the ship, but the bunks were stacked up 3 and 4, 5 high, and so on. I think the one memorable experience I had on that is that it became very rough in the mid-Atlantic, very rough. And the old ship was very light because all it had on it was the soldiers. And so the stern would come up, and that old propeller would, she'd come out of the water. But they wanted to keep us busy. So they decided that one of the things that would keep us busy was to do guard duty. Because we could never tell, who might try to climb on that boat.
I think this recorder has stopped for some reason. Oh, you gonna stop that? All right, you were telling me about being assigned to guard duty.
Being assigned to guard duty. So we each had to spend a few hours with our rifles guarding. And my assignment in the middle of the night during the biggest storm they had out in the Atlantic was at the stern of the ship. That's the back of the ship. Mm-hmm. And I was to guard against any Germans climbing up onto that ship. And I stood out there for a couple hours, with the rudder coming out of the water, and that wasn't a very pleasant experience. And made me decide maybe I was wise not going into the Navy. But I was one of the fortunate ones that I didn't get sick. But a good number of the men were sick. Mm-hmm. And so we finally got over to Europe, or calmer waters. And my division was the first division to land directly in France. And we landed at Cherbourg. And Cherbourg had just, that was in late September and so on. And of course, the invasion was in in June, so they had just cleared out that whole Normandy area. So we came in at Cherbourg and did our staging, what they call staging, in other words, getting ready in Normandy. So my first experience in Europe was in Normandy, with the hedgerows and so on, living in pup tents and with a lot of rain.
What was some of your initial impressions of the situation there when you got there in September?
People were poor. I mean, I had never seen that kind of. It was farmland. I had never seen a house where the people lived in one side and the cows lived in the other side, and it was really very rural. And I had never heard of the various liquors that they had. Of course, soldiers always go for the liquor and try to buy that. I'm sure every army in the world, the first thing that soldiers hid for was the booze. But there was none available. So it was very rural, and the hedgerows were so different, and we did our jobs in getting ready to go into combat, which we had no idea, at my level, no idea of what was going to happen.
Well, what was the mood? What was the conversation like? You remember among the men?
What was it like?
Yeah, I mean,
God, I wish this rain would quit.
Yeah.
No, I'm at the level I was. I mean, that's that's where you were. And then you had your various assignments to your units, but we had no idea what we were getting into. Absolutely none.
now you were in the Signal Corps.
I was in a signal company.
Signal company.
Yeah.
But you were doing wire.
I was a wireman. Yeah.
Yeah, you were a wireman. Yeah.
You had to climb telephone poles and lay the wire. And at that point, we had two vehicles in our unit, not in the signal company, but in our unit. One was a half-track, and the other was a Jeep. In an armored division, they didn't call them Jeeps, they called them Peeps. So we had those two vehicles, and they had wheels of wire on them, and you had the climbers and all that sort of stuff. So, and the telephone switchboard. I don't think we carried one, but we did have. So that's what we were learning how to do. And of course, a guy like myself hadn't been very well trained because we hadn't been with the division before. So we came in as pretty raw.
Well, not much in your radar operator training was helping you.
No, nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing.
So the staging area there, you're doing training and getting ready to begin your advance out of Cherbourg.
Correct.
Well, that's in, you said in September.
Well, it wasn't, it took us, because we went, I think it would be in the book there, but we left there in either late October or early November, I don't know the date, and headed out across France to the quote front lines, which were at that time around Metz, in Alsace-Lorraine region. So we went through Paris. My first experience in Paris is riding down the Champs-Élysées in a half-track and under the Arc de Triomphe and on the way. This is not I suppose, a appropriate memory, but in riding in the half-track, they didn't stop for anything. And I just had to go to the restroom. Of course, there was none available. So all I could do was hang out the back of that track going down the middle of Paris.
That's a very appropriate memory, and I guarantee it's not in that book. So that's your first introduction to Paris. Well, I was about to ask if you had any interactions with Parisians while you were there.
No, not Parisians.
Yeah, but in the countryside, did you have much interactions with the
Not as we were going through.
Yeah.
Because we were moving,
Mm-hmm.
and so we would just stop for the night.
And of course, all of this area was very secure.
Yeah, it was all secure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we went to in France all the way up to Metz, which is close to the Sarre River, Moselle, in that area. And that's the Maginot Line, really. And so our first combat experience was trying to penetrate the Maginot Line with the tanks and so on.
Can you walk me through that experience? Just, you're a soldier, but that first experience where you realize, okay, this is real and we're at war.
Yeah, it was not for us and the single company. What we would do is run wire from the either division headquarters to Combat Command B, which is equivalent to a regiment, or from Combat Command B up to battalion. So this was more or less of a stable front, and there were forays trying to go through that Maginot Line, but we did not. I heard a lot of artillery, but it was not intense combat at all. And the first real combat that I experienced was we went up to a town called Thionville, which is on the Moselle, close to Luxembourg.
Mm.
And at that point, we went through Thionville, and parts of the division were the 1st Army Division or into Germany, and it was a border. And I suppose another experience that I had in Thionville or outside Thionville, which is a very lasting, uncomfortable memory, is that we didn't have a lot of heavy clothing. We were getting it gradually, but we had, as a wireman, you had to go out and you work with your hands, so you had gloves. And I lost a glove, and there was no other glove, so I was without a glove. So we were parked on a road in the convoy, and I looked over there, and there was a whole pile of soldiers, dead soldiers. They just lined them up on the road, and then they were waiting for the mortuary trucks to come and pick them up. But they were mostly German soldiers. There was one American who was from our division, had the night before had been killed. So I went through those looking for gloves. I found a glove. And, excuse me, I took it from a young German soldier, and on his belt he had "God is with us." Gott mit uns. I'm sorry. I've had a post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah.
Some of this really gets 65 years left. I'll be okay in a minute.
No, you don't apologize, and please take your time.
But my thought was, Jesus, I've been praying to God all my life. And here's my enemy. But the same thing. It
Yeah.
didn't make sense. It didn't make any sense at all. I thought I had this under control, but it still comes back.
Well, you know, to have that sort of intimate encounter with the enemy and identify that had to be a very powerful moment for you.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
You know, what the hell are we doing here?
Yeah.
So we went through Thionville, and in that area, Mertz area, and if you want, you can read it in the book. And this was in December, early December, around December 13th, 14th. And that's when the Germans broke through on the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we were just south of Luxembourg. And the Germans had broke through, and the southern end of their line was in Luxembourg.
Mm-hmm.
You probably have heard this
So,
before.
so it was right above you. You were
Right above us.
right below the bulge. Yeah.
And so General Patton, in all his wisdom, said, we've got to stop the Germans. 10th Armored Division. So the 10th, on the 16th of December, was sent up to Luxembourg. And I remember the first night in the Luxembourg billet, and the division was split up. Part of it went to the front in Luxembourg, and the rest of us in CCB were sent to a town called Bastogne. I'm sorry. But we were sent to Bastogne. And our division was the first troops to stop the Germans. Show you what happened here. Maybe I'll get myself together here a little bit. I haven't done this in a long time. And we were the wire platoon that's attached to CCB, so we were the only wire group that's half-track and Jeep.
This is the map.
That's the map.
I see.
And as you can see, the whole German army was coming down. And our tankers and infantry stopped the you want me to wait?
No, you're fine.
Anyway, we were there about 18 hours before the 101st Airborne Division. And if we hadn't been there, Germans would have come right through.
That's right.
But if the 101st hadn't gotten there, well, we would have been eliminated. And as you probably know from history, the town was surrounded. And we did our duty. We laid our wire. And that's what this comes from.
Yeah.
So, starting with the 18th of December until early January when I was evacuated, why, yeah, we were there. And it was, but you didn't think about I wrote a little book about this. You didn't think about, you were going to die, because if you did, you were gone. You just did what you had to do. Well, maybe I have a little scotch.
Now we know that's why.
You didn't ask for it.
My wife has been through this. And so I don't know what to tell you about Bastogne, except that it was a pretty rough experience.
Well, I know in that period, it's every moment, right? It's.
Pardon?
There's no relief from it.
There's no relief.
It's constant.
Yeah, we were surrounded for about 5 or 6 days, and I remember when the 6 days. I remember when the airdrop came in and C-47s dropped supplies to us, and we were down to basic rations and no ammunition, and our track had been blown up, and it was just. But we had. I remember when McCullough said nuts. With the German surrender demand. But again, at my level, we had no idea how bad it was. We had no idea. And of course, this has been glorified in the movie with Patton and the Battle of the Bulge and all this sort of stuff. And the latest one is, let's see, that one with, what is it, Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks and the brothers.
Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers, yeah.
And but they never mentioned the 10th Armored, our division, because we were there right with them the whole time. But it was a glorified thing. Now it wasn't fun then.
No.
So in mid-January, sometime around there, I wasn't feeling too well. I went to the aid station and my eyes were yellow, so I had hepatitis, which is probably from the unsanitary conditions. And I was evacuated at that time. Went back through hospitals in Paris and Le Mans, France. And was sent back up to my division and joined the division in Trier. And our division had just taken Trier at that point. And that's when that was probably in early March. And from that point on, I was with the division till the end of the war.
Of course, the situation in March was
Well,
a world of difference than January.
yeah, it was, but
Yeah.
Trier was, had just taken, that's quite a, it was an old Roman town and so on. And I remembered when I got there and joined the group again, why they had just broken into some champagne factory. So I drank champagne out of a tin. A tin cup. But we went, from there we went through, they just broke through, went through Kaiserlautern up to the Rhine River, and there would be pockets of German resistance, but we were moving quite rapidly. Mm-hmm. So we came to the Rhine River around Mannheim, Ludwigshafen. Are you familiar with this geography?
Mm-hmm.
That's on the Rhine, and went across there, and the first city that we stayed in for a couple of days was Heidelberg. And at this point we had moved into the 7th Army from the 3rd Army because we were going south. And so I had my first experience in Heidelberg in at that time. I was there for a couple of days because we didn't stay too long. And then the division continued down south. And they, we just moved.
Yeah.
Tremendous differences, and we had pockets of resistance and so on. And we were just doing our duty, laying wire and keeping up with them.
So were there, did lines of communication stay pretty well open at that point?
Not the German lines.
No, the Allied lines.
Yeah, we were able to keep them open.
Mm-hmm.
And we had radio and so on. But they were moving awfully fast. And they had a great deal of difficulty around Kreilsheim, but I was not involved in that. I suppose another experience, we went to a town and stayed a couple of days, and I can't remember the name of it. I think it was Orangen, but there was a old German castle there, or palace, that we stayed in, actually. And it was an old German, I forget the name, Lohengrin. It's very similar to the name of Queen Elizabeth's husband's family. He was from Germany. And I remember being in the garden of that place, and this very elderly gentleman came out, and there was no resistance. And the servants came up to him and backed away from him. He was real royal sort of behavior, and it was such a contrast to the supposed Nazi regime and so on, and the military aspect of Germany, to see this really old world stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I managed the Liberator, I think a little suitcase and a fountain pen. That was, you never stole anything, you just liberated.
Liberated. There was a lot of things liberated.
Yeah, a lot of things were liberated.
Yeah.
And so we continued on south. And you want me to get into this camp?
Yeah, if you could, if you'll begin by talking about, anything you had heard of places like this, or...
We heard nothing.
Yeah.
And now at my level, we heard nothing, absolutely nothing. We didn't know what we were getting into. We just knew that we were going south. We knew we crossed the Danube River, Ulm, and I hardly knew Blue Danube was, but we were just going south. And we knew we were in Bavaria, and we knew that, I guess, one of the things that really hit me, was the contrast between France and Germany.
Mm.
France and the Alsace region was poor. I mean, it was, very rural. As soon as you went into Germany, it was clean. It was just like home. Mm. And nobody was a Nazi. We always built it to the, when you come into a town and you'd say, Raus, get out, and we would take over their home. It didn't make any difference, wherever the heck they went. But we didn't have to sleep in pub tents. And but it was such a contrast between people who were very clean and spotless and so on, and the French who were very rural and close to poverty level.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So on we went.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about. One thing that were you taking on prisoners at prisoners of war? That a lot of
we were taking. You see, in the book, you'll see that we were taking on tremendous numbers of prisoners,
yeah.
and they were And they were young kids, many of them. But we liberated thousands of, not liberated, but took thousands of prisoners, and you'd see them marching down the road, you know, being guarded and so on. I had no contact with them at that point.
Well, let's move into when you're getting into the Landsberg area, or is it Mittelbaum? Mittenbaum? I'm saying Mittingen. Okay. When you get into the Mittingen area and you begin to hear of the camps.
Didn't hear them. We just went into the camp.
Okay.
My experience, I have to talk about my experience.
Yes, well, I want to go through your experience.
My experience was all of a sudden, here we are, we're in a camp.
Okay.
And sleep in those barracks that they have there. And don't talk to the soldiers. There's a lot of Americans here. You can see the picture. Don't talk to them. I remember that because there might be German spies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure at the higher levels they knew what the situation was. And that was my first experience at seeing people with the striped uniforms that you've seen in the pictures. So that the picture here is of American prisoners, but there were really a lot of real concentration camp people. And the other thing that struck me was they looked like Mongolians. And they must have been from Russia or something like that. But there was a lot of people that didn't look like Germans or didn't look like us Caucasians. They were obviously from a different ethnic group. And they were wearing the striped uniforms, and they were milling around and so on. But they didn't want us to have any contact with them. And see, this was the first day that we were into this situation. You may not be familiar, or maybe you are, with how you're fed. You're fed off the back of a truck, and they have 3 GI cans, and you dip throw your garbage in one, and you dip your mess kit into another, and you clean it and rinse it off over here. And what I remember is those guys in those uniforms standing by the garbage.
Any sort of sustenance that they could get.
Pardon?
Any sort of sustenance that they could get.
They were eating that garbage. And then we left.
Now, you were instructed for security concerns not to interact that much?
Yeah.
Did you say that was the concern?
Yeah. See, that was the first and second day.
Yeah.
And I just remember, and I can't tell you, verify this in any way, I just remember, don't talk to them, or don't talk to the Americans.
Can you describe what the camp looked like? Or what you remember the camp looking like?
Well, I remember barracks buildings, and very crude barracks buildings, and bunks stacked 3 and 4 high, and I can't remember much more. It was, southern in Bavaria. I can't remember the mountains at that point, but it was. We had driven through Meiningen, I remember that, and there was a nice city, and there was no resistance.
Well, I can imagine from how you describe, them looking for any sort of food, the appearance, you talked about the stripe, but I imagine the condition you noticed of the...
But they weren't the Americans, they weren't the prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Because they found there was about 3 or 4 guys from our division who had been captured during the Bastogne, who were in the camp. And I never saw them, but apparently they identified themselves. And they were all still in their uniforms or, their army clothes.
Mm.
But I never saw those guys too much. It was mostly the guys eating out of the garbage can.
Had it been a work camp? Do you know if it was a work
I
camp?
think it was a work camp, yeah.
Yeah.
It was not a death camp.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm sure people died right and left, but it was a work camp.
Mm-hmm.
And that Dachau, I think might have been they call it a Stalag number, but it probably was some offshoot of Dachau or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
My neighbor will tell you about that.
Yeah. So did the prisoners who were in the camp stay around, or did they leave while you were there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Y'all kept moving.
Huh?
Y'all kept
We kept going south.
Yeah.
So we went south, and my unit, CCB, went into Austria at the town of Fussen, Fussen. And this was our first entry into Austria. And within a day or so, we were in the town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Garmisch-Partenkirchen was the center of the 1968 right there Olympics. And it was in Austria, near the Zugspitze. The Zug is train in German. The mountains,
Mm.
and at that point, this was around the 1st of May, that was it. So we occupied Garmisch from that point up until September.
Mm. Well, you told me your impressions of France and Germany. What were your impressions of Austria?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. As a matter of fact, while I was there, Zugspitze had was quite a tourist area, and there was a train that went up the mountain, and I remember taking the train and the cable car all the way up to the top to Schneefer House, the snow house, which is, I did my first skiing at over 10,000 feet on the there, and we used that area, and it was a beautiful area. Subsequently, after the war, became a recreational center for American troops.
Mm.
But it was beautiful.
Mm.
Put us up in the Bahnhof Hotel, train station hotel, and from there we did our job of laying wires, getting communication going, and never found a Nazi.
Well, where were you when you heard of the surrender?
Right in Garmisch.
Yeah. And do you remember how you responded when you heard?
It was relief. But all we could think about was, I suppose now we had to go to Japan. And that actually was the word. You're going to go to the east.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no question about that. So we were there for some time, and I became sick in Garmisch. Again, was sent back to a hospital in France, Nancy, France, which is near Metz.
Mm.
And while there, I was looking through the roster at the Red Cross workers, and I saw his name, and I said, my God, it's one of my sisters and one of our family's my sister's best girlfriend. was in the Red Cross. Lois Nelson. And so I immediately had a contact in the hospital with Lois, and I became sort of a volunteer for the Red Cross there. It was fun. And I went back and joined the division, and then in September, they had a point system, you know, a number of years in service and so on. And then you went home depending upon how many points you had. And I did not, since we came in, most of us came in late to the division, we did not go with the division to leave in September to go back to the States. So I was assigned and sent to the 71st Division in Augsburg, Germany, which is a little bit north. And stayed there for some time, doing nothing. And
What did you do to pass the time?
nothing. It was, I think I did some work in finance, but really nothing much. And then started the trek home, went to Antwerp. Never got to England. So, and I arrived back in the States in mid-January after a 10-day trip across the Atlantic again.
Well, I ask about VE Day. Where do you remember hearing the news of VJ Day?
Yeah, I think I was on a train coming back from the hospital, and in a 40 and 8 car. They used to put us in 40 and 8 cars. You know what a 40 and 8?
I do not know what a 40 and 8 car is.
40 men or 8 horses. That's an old, in other words, it was not a passenger car.
Yes.
And but that was the name, 40 and 8. And I remember that. And it was not, I don't think the impact really hit it, but we realized then we wouldn't be going to Japan.
Well, I know you were anxious to get back home.
Oh yeah, I was.
We've already established you didn't want to be a career.
I established. Oh, I had a girlfriend over there, and I thought, gave it some thought, but fortunately, I decided that wasn't the route to go. So I came back. I think I was discharged January 16th from Camp Grant in Rockford, Illinois. Immediately went home to Chicago. And I think a week later, something like that, I called Iris because we had been in correspondence, and went up to her house on the north side of Chicago. And Iris, can you describe that? Is she there?
She's there.
You tell it.
Huh?
She wants you to tell it.
It's your story.
Well, I remember going to her house, and it was in this, again, the Swedish community. And I think we saw each other, and that was it.
Were you Swedish enough for them?
Her father was an immigrant,
Uh-huh.
and her mother had lived in Sweden, and she lived in it was really a very ethnic Swedish community.
Yeah.
With North Park University, which is at that time was very Swedish,
Yeah.
church-related school, and but it was we had known each other from church experiences when we were kids. So the church I went to and the church she went to were part of the same denomination. So we were very familiar with, although I am not familiar with her father's Swedish accent, so
So were you married that spring?
we were married when was it? Oh, May
May.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, you may have an anniversary coming up.
May 25th, wasn't it ours?
Yes.
You better remember that.
And the Swedish church. And at that point, I had already started Illinois Tech.
Okay.
And then I transferred to the University of Chicago. I had about a year and a half or something like that. And my professor at Dr. Boder at Illinois Tech suggested I go to Chicago. Now, it was very interesting about Boder. Boder was an old Latvian immigrant from years back who had gone originally to Mexico and did some work down there as a psychologist, and then came up to Chicago and became a professor at Illinois Tech. But he had a Jewish background. And after the war, or right after, he got the idea of doing oral histories with people who had been in concentration camps.
Interesting.
And so he took an old wire recorder and went over to Europe to interview concentration camp survivors. And the interesting thing was that the wire recorder at that time was patented and developed at the University of Chicago, rather at Illinois Tech.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and I remember having a professor by the name of Hayakawa, who subsequently was a senator from California, brought that into class. This was before the war, and demonstrated it to us. But anyway, David went over to Europe, and he recorded all these interviews with people. He came back, and he had all these wires. Now, you guys don't know what a wire recorder is, but if that wire becomes goofed up, I mean, you got problems. And it was just a very thin wire. And so he gave me a little job of helping him sort of straighten out those reels of wire, because when he got over there, he didn't realize there was a different current. You know, we have 110 or 220 over there, so there was a different speed associated with those damn things. Didn't wind correctly. So he had all this data on wire that was almost impossible to regain. He subsequently has written a book about that, by the way, those interviews. It's David Boder, B-O-D-E-R. I don't have a copy of the book, but he did publish it. And I'm sure through Amazon or through your through the
library.
To the libraries, you can find that book. But it would be some of your best information about the experience of the concentration camp, the death camps.
Were you able to save any of the recordings?
No,
No.
but I don't know if he did. I just spent time with him in his home, and that's when he introduced me to classical music and so on. They were very German. He had lived in Germany, in Austria. So that was a very interesting experience. But anyway, I went to the University of Chicago, and at the time I went, Iris, were you pregnant then? Yeah.
Yes, I had to.
We didn't control things as well back then.
You would have scheduled this differently if you had thought about it. Yeah.
And we were living on the north side, and I'd take the streetcar and the elevated train down to Chicago. And Iris helped me quite a bit. We had some contacts.
Before you got into Chicago.
Pardon?
Before you got started at the University of Chicago, you had that ruptured appendix.
Oh yeah.
Oh, your appendix ruptured.
Up in there, and I went to the Swedish hospital, Nowadays it would be nothing, but then it was quite a bit. And so Iris had to go down to the university and register me, didn't you?
I had to go down to university at about 8.5 months pregnant to register you at the university.
And
Fortunately, we had a friend down there that helped me.
Oh,
one of our friends down there was from the same Swedish community, and we had two friends. And one of them was, at that time, an adjunct professor or something like that. He subsequently became president of North Park University. But so I started out in psychology, went into psychology at that point. And I suppose another relevant thing is that's when this darn post-traumatic thing really hit me. And so I went over to the counseling center in Chicago and asked for some help. I didn't go to the VA. Probably my life would have been differently if I had gone to the VA, because a lot of soldiers did. So I started out in psychotherapy there. And at that time, in 1948, a professor had come from the University of Ohio to Chicago to take over the counseling center. And he was probably, at that point, one of the outstanding psychologists in the United States. His name was Carl Rogers. And he's published a tremendous amount. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I've heard that name.
Yeah. And he was director of the counseling center. He was not my therapist, but I became influenced by that experience, and that's when I moved into clinical psychology.
Well, I'd like to ask you a little bit about that, because it is an unusual, I just know my wife's a psychologist, I said, and not a lot of psychologists, especially that do clinical work, have necessarily been in counseling themselves. So how did that, do you think that experience, how did it make you feel about psychology or going into psychology? Do you think that changed your career path?
Well, it helped. I had about 300 hours of therapy, but I never had any medication or anything. If I'd gone to the VA, it would have been different.
Yeah.
So I had, my life was built around that.
Yeah.
And I subsequently, had, you see, in Chicago at that time, did not give a bachelor's degree. So I went on for the master's and then decided to go on for the PhD. And I worked with Rogers. Rogers was my dissertation advisor.
So I joked about it earlier, what was your PhD research?
Oh, it was a study of psychotherapy, and physiological measurements during therapy. And it's published. And I worked on that and became, they called him an extern, and I was hired by the counseling center to do things. And my last appointment was as a United States Public Health Fellow in clinical psychology. But I continued working with these people. All I knew was working in a therapeutic environment. And Rogers was so different. At that time, he was probably the most controversial and the most well-known psychologist in the nation, and actually in the world. Because while at the counseling center, people used to come in from all over the world to study with him. And our situation was so different than most graduate programs. The graduate students were involved in the decision-making processes. So I had contact with people, brought them over for dinner from priests from, I remember one priest from a Jesuit from Netherlands, and people like this. And it was a eye-opening experience, really. So different from our old ethnic background. And so in 1952, two of my colleagues there, who I was very close to, the graduate students, one of my professors went to the University of Texas, Carson McGuire brought in, and he brought in Bill Kell, who was a graduate student ahead of me. And then he brought in another guy who I was very, very close to, called Oliver Bound, at the University of Texas. And they needed another psychologist at the counseling center there. So they put the finger on me. So we got in their old Hudson and came down to Texas in 1952. And that talk about culture shock. That was culture shock.
And you settled in the Swedish community, and I'm just
No, not exactly. Oops, I'm sorry. So we started out there, and I didn't have my degree, I was ABT.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 52. I finished up my dissertation in December of 54. And when I had gone up to Chicago for my master's, I didn't walk for the PhD, which I regret very much because it was at Rockefeller Chapel, beautiful ceremony. And so I had my PhD then, and in this is 55, early 55, a position opened up at Tech, and I was recruited for it. They paid more money. I think it was a couple $1,000s more a year.
Double your salary.
Huh?
Virtually double your salary.
Yeah, it was. So I came up to here in a dust store.
Talk about culture shock.
My
yeah,
first,
Austin was one thing, but Lubbock is a completely other thing.
Oh, boy.
my first experience with Lubbock, coming up for the job interview, was I flew Braniff Airline. No, it wasn't even, it was before Braniff, in a DC-3 coming up here, and it was a dust storm. And that airplane tried to land here at the airport about 4 times and couldn't make it through the dust storm. So they went up to Amarillo and landed up there, and we took a taxi down to Lubbock. And that was my introduction to Lubbock, Texas. So we decided to take the job with more money. I mean, you go where the buck is. And faculty positions were hard to come by at that point.
Yeah.
So we started out here.
Was that because a lot of GIs were graduating with degrees?
Yeah.
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 And it was a flooded job market.
Excuse me, I'll turn it off for a minute.
Sure.
We
All
were
right, now Iris reminded me of a story that you need to tell about back at Bastogne.
Well, we were laying wire in the town. You know, we would just go through and lay wire any place. You didn't worry about telephone poles, just put it over houses and everything. And the order went out to the civilians that if you get caught cutting wire, you'd be shot. So Sergeant came down and he says, yeah, they caught an old boy clipping some wire over his doorway. You and the other guy, you go up, take the Jeep and go over there and get that guy. And so we drove through the town, and the guy was under guard. And what you did, you had your Jeep, and there was a steel pole, iron pole that went up in front of the Jeep, and they used that so that when you go down the road, it would clip wires. And so he would sit on the front of the Jeep on the hood and hold on to that. And of course the order was, if he gets out, shoot him. and then he'll be executed when he gets back. And the sergeant said, well, you guys are going to have to shoot him. And oh my God, you know, the impact of having to execute somebody. And so they interviewed the officers interviewed him, and they decided not to execute him. And if I had to do that, I don't know what would have happened. Because that was, it's one thing when people are shooting at you. It's another thing when, you know, you stand somebody up and just murder him. Oh, I suppose another experience was I was up in a pole fixing a wire and in Bastogne, and all of a sudden mortar shells kept dropping by. And I said, they're aiming at me, and because they were only about a mile away. And so I came down that pole, and I said, I'm not going to be a wireman when I grow up, I'll tell you. I'm going to go back to school. And but anyway, we changed our focus a little bit. I became very much involved in rehabilitation work, training rehabilitation counselors, and subsequently went up through the ranks at Tech. And in the 60s, I went into private practice as a psychologist.
I see.
And I was part-time at Tech and part-time at practice, so I was right over here at the hospital.
What sort of population were you working with in private practice?
Anything that could be referred to me.
Okay.
I called myself a psychological general practitioner.
I see.
And we became very much involved with kids and so on, children with learning disabilities. And finally, my friend who was a department chair came and said, come on back to the university and we'll give you tenure and we want you to direct a program. But I did it on the condition that I could continue in my practice, because I had pretty well established here. I was the first psychologist in private practice in Lubbock, with an office in a medical facility. And I continued, came back to Tech and continued with that. And, let's see, I quit Tech when I was 70, that was 18 years ago. But I continued my practice up until 4 or 5 years ago, Iris? No, we hadn't moved here. It was before, over 7 years ago, we stopped. She's a psychologist also. It was a good career, so I've had a very close career with psychology in a medical setting.
Well, and you know, to think of psychology, the changes you saw in the field.
I could not practice now. No, I could not practice now. It's like the old physician, you know. You know the words and everything, but really the technology has changed so much. And the whole focus. What does your wife do? Is she in practice or?
She does clinical work, but she's not practicing right now, but she'll start practicing again. She's licensed in Texas.
Yeah, see, I was on the licensing board. Some years ago, I could have signed her license for her. I was the chairman of the board.
Well, when you say you couldn't practice now, what are the things you're thinking of when you say that?
Oh, the techniques. There's two things. One is the whole emphasis upon billing and so on. We didn't have any of that stuff, the insurance stuff, which is just killing these people out. And the other thing is that neuropsychology, I was doing some of the original work on that, but it has moved far beyond where I was when I was playing with it, because one of the guys that I went to Chicago with was one of the leaders in development of some of these tests, right hand. And then the cognitive behavioral stuff and the old psychotherapy as I knew it. I mean, Freud is out of the business, and we were very influenced by Dreiker's Adlerian psychology, and very much so. He even had Rudolf Dreiker's down here. But I mean, they just don't. Things have changed, and I would say this: our granddaughter, is a doctoral student at the University of Colorado in psychology, but she's not in clinical psychology. Believe me, she's a research psychologist in what they call cognitive psychology. And her mother and daddy are both psychologists, and the old clinical psychologists. And that's not the way to go right now. I don't think.
Well, it was a wonderful career for you, it sounds like.
It was a very good career. That's why we're here.
Yeah. But it's interesting you mentioned earlier, I just caught a hint of it. If you had been working at the psychiatrist with the VA versus going into psychotherapy, how that might have changed.
Well,
Yeah.
Probably I would have gotten on medication at that time, what they were using. And I could have been a patient at a VA hospital. Well, you know,
Sure.
you had a big one at Waco, you had a big one at Temple. But it just would have been different.
Well, you got to experience the benefits.
I had the
Yeah.
experience with Rogers,
Yeah.
which had a lasting, lifelong effect.
Yeah, the medication was Thorazine, wasn't it?
Pardon?
The medication was Thorazine back then?
Yeah,
Thorazine's what they were using.
yeah, for the VA
Side
shuffle.
effects that were not very good.
So I did it the hard way, but I did it the good way.
Well, there's a lot I could still ask you, but I want to be sensitive to your time. Are there some things that we've remembered a couple of stories? There are some things I should have asked you about. Can you think that we didn't necessarily cover?
Well, I think one thing is very interesting is that while I was at Tech, we started to get students. Some students wanted to go into the Army, and the deal was if they enlisted in the Army as graduate students, they would be inducted into the Army as second or first lieutenants. So I became a consultant to the Army. And so I spent time on consulting visits to William Beaumont Medical Center. Iris and I have been up to the Pentagon in a visit with the chief psychologist up there, and I've been to several different Army settings. So here I was, a buck private, and now I'm a consultant for the medical corps. That was a good experience, and we trained quite a few psychologists who went into the Army, and then as soon as they got their degrees or as they went into active duty, they became captains. And one guy went all the way up to be the chief of psychological services for the Army.
Well, now I also wanted to ask you, because you mentioned it earlier, reunions. I know you've been involved in reunions.
Yeah.
What has that meant for you over the years?
Well, I became involved about 15 years ago, late, and to the national group. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, they had this Western chapter, and I met with them, and it was a smaller group, and of course at a reunion what you do is play I Remember When, you know. And subsequently I went up, we had a reunion here once in Lubbock, which was the best one they've ever had. It's been a good experience. The group is getting smaller, obviously, and all of us are younger. None of us are officers. We're officers because we were all here. I'm 88, and I'm one of the young ones.
That's a good feeling when you get together to be one of the young
Yeah.
ones. Yeah.
And I probably won't continue much longer because having these reunions out in Phoenix, and it's just, I can't drive anymore on the highway. It's just too much.
Yeah, it's
But
hard.
it's been very, very good,
Yeah.
very good. And by the way, as I said before, the ASTP boys are the ones who've gone up. I think our current president is a son of a veteran, but the last few presidents have all been ASTPers. That to me is interesting.
I think it's a tragedy because there was a cream of the crop and then they went and put in infantries and stuff and mowed them all down.
Yeah.
Oh, some of the divisions, I may not be exactly historically accurate, but one of the divisions that was sent up to man the front lines before the Bulge was 106th Infantry Division, which was composed of a large number of ASDP boys. And they just sent them over there, and that was supposed to be the quiet front. And they put those boys right up there in December, and that's where the Germans hit.
Yeah.
And they were devastated.
Yes.
And we had, our infantry had high casualties too. And so many of the lower level people they were nice bright college boys.
Well, Dr. Anderson, I want to thank you for your two things, for your time today and for your service to our country. And I know Robert wants to thank you for that too.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Robert, were there any questions that you wanted to ask?
I did want to follow up on the ASTP real quick. I wanted to go revisit that. If you could talk a little bit more, we had discussed with another veteran who was not in the ASTP program, and he discussed a tension when the ASTP men arrived. Was there any tension in the 10th Armored Division?
Well, all our commissioned officers at that time, they already had their ranks. And I don't think there was a lot of tension. Hell, we were just cannon fodder. And I think if anything, there could have been some resentment. We got a bunch of untrained guys. But I didn't feel that tension. And the very few of us went up in rank because we moved so fast and got into this combat. And hell, they were devastated. I forget our casualty numbers, but they're pretty good, and the wounded and so on.
Well, your training was not very good.
And the training was not good. And a lot of these boys going into the infantry units, they weren't trained at all.
Yeah.
And I resent that. And not my service as such, but the fact that if you read the history of the ASTP, you'll see that General Marshall and a couple of the others didn't want this program in the first place. And subsequently it went through, and then it was wiped out,
Yeah.
in March of 1944.
Yeah, overnight, yeah.
Yeah, you'll find that out from Dr. Hartman too.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Okay. Sorry I